All right, today we are in the book of 1 Samuel, and we're going to be studying chapter 25. We'll be going through the whole chapter. Let's start in verse 1, and we're going to be reading from the King James Version. And Samuel died, and all the Israelites were gathered together, and lamented him, and buried him in his house at Ramah. And David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. So Samuel, we see here, has passed away. His ministry ended. And every ministry has an end. It says in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die." Remember, John the Baptist was beheaded. Moses' ministry ended there. We read about that at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. He died there in the land of Moab. Actually, was buried there. And here we see the death of Samuel. Now, not much is said about him here. You remember that when Moses died, Joshua, or whoever finished the book of Deuteronomy, included an extra 3 verses to describe the special type of man Moses was. Now, we don't get much of an obituary here, but God has not finished using Samuel. So stay tuned for chapter 28. Now, I'm just wondering out loud, I wonder if David went down to Paran because of Samuel's death. Paran was near the southern border of the country. But let's move on in our passage here. It says, "And there was a man in Maon whose possessions were in Carmel. And the man was very great, and he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. And she was a woman of good understanding and of a beautiful countenance. But the man was churlish," which means cruel, "and evil in his doings, and he was of the house of Caleb." Now, the sheep shearing was done in the springtime, either by the owners or by regular hired workers or shearers. So we know approximately what time of the year this particular passage occurred. It was a significant celebration characterized by feasting, drunkenness, and the settling of old scores. Now, I don't want to take too much time to go into it, but it is a fascinating study if you'd like to look into it yourself. When you examine the 4 times that is mentioned in the Scriptures, we see during each of the times that is mentioned, it provides the setting for the avenging of a wrong. And then in all 4 instances where it's mentioned, this is true. So let's look here at a few of these characters, starting with Nabal. Now, the name Nabal in Hebrew means fool. Now, I guess the first question that I would ask is, why would anyone want to name their child fool? But maybe they didn't even know the true meaning of that word. I think about people still using the name Jacob to name their young children, their young little boys. But if you look at the Hebrew meaning of Jacob, it means supplanter, or something that's easier for us to understand, to take the place of another through force or scheming. So is that what you want your son to become? Someone like that? Well, you named him that way. You named him Jacob, right? So names are very important. We will find that Nabal has been living up to his name. It mentions that he was of the house of Caleb. Now, Caleb was a ruler from the tribe of Judah in the time of Moses. He was one of the 12 men chosen to scout out the promised land back in Numbers chapter 13. There it indicates that he was a good man and full of faith, and he encouraged the people to believe in the Lord and go in and take the promised land. Yet, when I was thinking about this, I thought about that old saying, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Yet here we see an exception. We can't expect Caleb's descendants to have the same character as Caleb did. Being the child of a righteous man does not automatically guarantee that that particular child will serve the Lord. Everyone has their own free will. Even if you look back earlier in the book of Samuel, back in chapter 8, it said there in verse 3, speaking of Samuel's children, "And his sons, Samuel's sons, walked not in his ways, but turned after unjust gain or lucre, and took bribes and perverted judgment. So moving on to his wife, the name Abigail means "my father is joy." She seems to be a very special type of lady, perhaps on par with the woman described in Proverbs 31. Now, this is more than likely an arranged marriage, yet I think it is important to point out here, just briefly, that one needs to be very wise when choosing a mate or a spouse. It needs to be with much prayer and a close examination of that person's personal walk with Christ. For the Lord said, "Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers." So obviously, your spouse needs to know the Lord. And it's also good to get some wise counsel. It says in the Proverbs that in the multitude of counselors there is safety. So back to our text here. It says, "And David heard in the wilderness that Nabal did shear his sheep. And David sent out 10 young men, and David said unto the young men, Get you up to Carmel, and go to Nabal, and greet him in my name. And thus shall you say to him that lives in prosperity, Peace be both to thee, and peace be to thine house, and peace be unto all that you have. And now I have heard that thou hast shearers. Now thy shepherds which were with us, we hurt them not, neither was there aught missing unto them, all the while they were in Carmel. Ask thy young men, and they will show thee. Wherefore let the young men find favor in thine eyes, for we come in a good day. Give, I pray thee, whatsoever comes to thine hand unto thy servants and to thy son David. And when David's young men came, they spake to Nabal according to all those words in the name of David, and ceased." Now, I want you to be aware that here we see the appearance of another number, the number 10. Now, it appears twice in this chapter. Also, if you look at the possessions of Nabal, most of them were divisible by the number of 10. Now, the number 10 is symbolic as the number of testing. Now, I want you to continue to stay sensitive to the appearance of these numbers in the passages, since they will help us to determine what is the main theme in the passage that we are studying. Now, I know we've gone over this before, but just a few examples of the number 10 here. If you go back to the time when Jacob's sons went down into Egypt to buy bread at the end of the book of Genesis, 10 of Jacob's sons went down, and then Joseph tested them. God said to the Israelites in the wilderness, "Because all those men which have seen my glory and my miracles which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have tempted or tested me now these 10 times, and have not hearkened to my voice," that's in Numbers chapter 14, verse 22. And the final example here in the book of Revelation, it says, "Fear none of those things which you shall suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that you may be tried, and you shall have tribulation 10 days. That's in the book of Revelation chapter 2, verse 10. Now, the number 3 is the number of communion or fellowship. So in this chapter, we have 3 people sharing a similar situation. All are being tested. Nabal, Abigail, and also David. So getting back to our text, verse 10, "And Nabal answered David's servants and said, Who is David, and who is the son of Jesse? There be many servants nowadays that break away every man from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my flesh that I have killed for my shearers and give it unto men whom I know not whence they be?" So it seems that the rumors have been spreading, the false rumors, actually, about what David has been doing. Nabal is still living up to his name and being foolish. First of all, he shouldn't judge without good information. Second, he should know that David is a warrior, and it was probably not a good idea to get him upset. I guess the only positive thing you could say about Nabal is that he is consistent in his foolishness, and he also has good choice in women. Yet I wonder if David knew that this was the character of Nabal, and I'm sure that Nabal knew about David since they were both from the same tribe, and I'm sure Nabal had heard the songs that were written about David. Now, if you remember back earlier in this book, David is very sensitive to being wrongly accused. The report about what Nabal said must have certainly hit a nerve with David. You remember back in chapter 17 how Eliab, his older brother, treated him. And Saul was constantly charging David with wrongdoing. And here we have Nabal adding to that chorus. It may be that this was a straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. Now, we also need to look at the heart of David and also into our own hearts. what is the motivation for doing what we do? Was David watching over this man's possessions because he knew it was the right thing to do? Or was it simply as a way to obtain some much-needed resources for his men? Jesus said in Luke chapter 6, "But love ye your enemies, and do good, and lend, hoping for nothing again. And your reward shall be great, and ye shall be the children of the highest, for he is kind unto the unthankful and to the evil." So again, we have to ask the question, what was David's motivation for watching over Nabal's sheep? Was it for a heavenly reward or for an earthly reward? Was he simply treating Nabal's servants with kindness because it was the right thing to do? I mean, many things we do in this life for Christ are not going to be recognized by men. They will be recognized by God. We know that the Lord is watching and he has promised to reward us. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, we find it written, "Some men's sins are open beforehand, going before to judgment, and some men they follow after. Likewise also the good works of some are manifest beforehand, and they that are otherwise cannot be hid." So back to our text, verse 12. "So David's young men turned their way, and went again, and came and told him all those things. And David said unto his men, Gird ye on every man his sword. And they girded on every man his sword. And David also girded on his sword. And there went up after David about 400 men, and 200 abode by the stuff. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, Behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to salute our master. And he railed on them. But the men were very good unto us, and we were not hurt, neither missed we anything, as long as we were conversant with them when we were in the fields. They were a wall unto us, both by night and day, all the while we were with them keeping the sheep. Now therefore know and consider what you will do. For evil is determined against our master, and against all his household. For he is such a son of Belial, that a man cannot speak to him." Now, I think it's very dangerous to assume that a person will act in a certain way, either this way or that. We can never be sure how someone will react in any given situation. Sometimes we don't even know how we will react. Without knowing who they are and how they live their life, what type of character they have, or if they're saved, they're witness for Christ, we should never assume a certain behavior. We need to be very observant of how people act to get a clue of how they might act in the future. Now, I guess David thought that he was acting as sort of a personal security guard for Nabal's possessions. Yet Nabal never asked him to do that. Now, the servants of Nabal call him a son of Belial. Now, in the New Testament, the name Belial is found in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 15, where it is used as a name of Satan, the personification of all that is evil. So we can't expect everyone who calls themselves a Christian to act in a Christ-like way. I think it is important to focus on your own spiritual walk and be ready to pray for others as they make their journey as well. We are all growing at different rates in the Lord. Some people's growth have stunted. Some may be in a growth spurt. Everyone's at a different place. In verse 18, back to our text, it says, Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 bottles of wine and 5 sheep ready dressed and 5 measures of parched corn and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on asses. Now, these resources would have been readily available since the feast was on par with that of a king, and a good thing it was, because time was of the essence. Verse 19, And she said unto her servants, Go on before me, behold, I come after you. But she told not her husband Nabal. Now, was this right or wrong, not to tell Nabal? I put forth the question, do we need to be completely honest and share all that is going on in our life with everyone around us? Now, I'm not specifically talking about a marriage relationship here. Yet I wonder if we always need to be completely open and honest with our family, with our friends, our spouses, our brothers and sisters at church. Is that critically important with all information? I believe that God counsels us to be very wise with the sharing of information, especially if you are in leadership or perhaps in the prayer ministry. Some information is only meant for certain people's ears. One example comes to mind, which we see earlier in the book. You remember that Samuel was told by God back in chapter 16 to go to Jesse and anoint a new king from among his sons. But Samuel was afraid that Saul would find out. So what did God say? The Lord said, "Take a heifer with thee, and say, I am come to sacrifice to the Lord. And call Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show thee what thou shalt do, and thou shalt anoint unto me him whom I name unto thee." Now, this sacrifice that Samuel was doing was just a cover story to conceal the true purpose of Samuel's visit. Also, you remember back in chapter 14 that Jonathan decided to go fight with the Philistines by himself. Well, his armor bearer was with him, but he didn't tell Saul, his father, what he was going to do. Saul more than likely would have forbid him to go because he was the king's son and heir to the throne. I mean, by all earthly standards, it was a pretty dangerous thing to do, to take on the whole army by himself. But Jonathan was that kind of person, and he was stepping out by faith on what he believed his God could do. He did share his heart with a trusted friend, his armor bearer, and this man, this armor bearer, was ready to follow Jonathan into the gates of hell. Now, this is the type of friend we need to have at our side, who we can always confide in. So, moving on to verse 20, "And it was so, as she rode on the ass, that she came down by the covert of the hill, and behold, David and his men came down against her, and she met them. Now David had said, Surely in vain have I kept all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that pertained unto him. And he hath requited me evil for good. So and more also do God unto the enemies of David, if I leave of all that pertained to him by the morning light any that pisses against the wall." And when Abigail saw David, she hasted and lighted off the ass, and fell before David on her face, and bowed herself to the ground. Now, when you think about this reaction of David, it was pretty severe. I mean, honestly, what did Nabal's servants do? He said he's going to kill every guy, every man, and Nabal. He's going to kill everybody there on Nabal's property. I mean, these servants simply were just obeying the wishes of their master. We find that at many times there can be collateral damage due to the sins of one individual, or the perceived actions of an individual. You remember back in chapter 22, Saul accused Ahimelech, the priest, of conspiring against him. But Ahimelech didn't do anything wrong. He was innocent. But what did Saul do? He not only killed Ahimelech and all his family, actually one did escape, but destroyed every last man, woman, and child and animal in the city of Nob, the city of the priests. So here we see Nabal is being foolish. David is acting rashly, yet Abigail was wise, and she took up the mantle of a peacekeeper. She knew what was the right thing to do. Now, she really had no idea what David's intentions were or whether her efforts would be successful, but she was going to try anyways. We can infer from David's words that he would have spared the women, but she did not know that. So verse 24, "And she fell at his feet and said, Upon me, my Lord, upon me let this iniquity be, and let thine handmaid, I pray, speak in thine audience, and hear the words of thine handmaid. Let not my Lord, I pray thee, regard this man of Belial, even Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, thine handmaid, saw not the young man of my Lord, whom thou didst send. Now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as thy soul lives, seeing the Lord is withholden thee from coming to shed blood, and from avenging thyself with thine own hand, now let thine enemies, and they that seek evil to my Lord, be as Nabal. And now this blessing which thine handmaid has brought unto my Lord, let it even be given unto the young men that follow my Lord. I pray thee, forgive the trespass of thine handmaid, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord fights the battles of the Lord, and evil has not been found in thee all thy days. Yet a man is risen to pursue thee, and to seek thy soul. But the soul of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of life with the Lord thy God, and the souls of thine enemies. Them shall he sling out, as out of the middle of a sling. And it shall come to pass, when the Lord shall have done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning thee, and shall have appointed thee ruler over Israel, that this shall be no grief unto thee, nor offense of heart unto my Lord, either that thou hast shed blood causeless, or that my Lord has avenged himself. But when the Lord shall have dealt well with my Lord, then remember thine handmaid." As I was reading this passage, I was thinking about that proverb that Solomon wrote, David's son, will write, as we get to the book of Proverbs. In chapter 16, it says, "The wrath of a king is as messengers of death, but a wise man or woman will pacify it." Now here we have the speech of Abigail. Now we can find a lot happening here in this speech. Number one, she was humble. She accepted responsibility even though it was not her fault. Now, a humble person always recognizes their own sin and does not cast stones at others, but hopes in the grace of God for their lives and the lives of others. She believed in the prophecy of David becoming the next king of Israel. And she was acting correctly. As Solomon's son David would eventually write again in the book of Proverbs, a gift in secret pacifies anger, and a reward in the bosom strong wrath. That's in chapter 21 of Proverbs. And if you'll notice there in verse 29, she uses the sling analogy, which would have special meaning for David. She said, "But the soul of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of life with the Lord thy God." Now the bundle is simply the bag, and this may have been a reference to David Shepherd's bag. That has been a very useful item for him. He used it in his fight with Goliath when he gathered those 5 stones from the stream. He used that bag to carry the stones. She was also keeping David from sinning, because in Deuteronomy chapter 32, it's written, "To me belongs vengeance and recompense. Their foot shall slide in due time, for the day of their calamity is at hand, and the things that shall come upon them make haste." The scripture says that to God belongs vengeance. He's the only righteous one who has all the information in order to judge righteously. We don't have all the information. Therefore, it's always my counsel that if you think a particular person should be called out or their sin should be exposed, I would just start praying about that. That would be the first thing I do, and I keep praying until the Lord gives me some clear direction. Now, this particular verse about vengeance seems to have more meaning when you finish the chapter and find out what finally happened to Nabal. I also think it's interesting that at the very end she puts in a word for herself, asking to be remembered, and David eventually did remember her. It reminds me of Joseph in his story when he was talking to one of the Pharaoh's servants and said, "Please remember me." So going on to verse 32, "And David said to Abigail, Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, which sent thee this day to meet me. And blessed be thine advice, and blessed be thou, which hast kept me this day from coming to shed blood and from avenging myself with mine own hand. For in very deed, as the Lord God of Israel lives, which has kept me back from hurting thee, except you had hastened and come to meet me, surely there had not been left unto Nabal by the morning light any that pisses against the wall. So David received of her hand that which she had brought him, and said unto her, Go up in peace to thine house. See, I have hearkened to thy voice, and have accepted thy person." In Proverbs chapter 9, it says, "Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be yet wiser. Teach a just man, and he will increase in learning." So here we see the heart of David. Now, some men simply will not take any advice from a woman. They think, well, I'm the man, and my way is best. Many men are not willing to listen to anyone's opinion, much less that of a woman. But here we find the humility of David. He saw that the advice was good and sound, and he respected it. He admired her for it, and he listened to it. Verse 36, "And Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he held a feast in his house like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunken. Wherefore she told him nothing less or more until the morning light. But it came to pass in the morning, when the wine was gone out of Nabal, and his wife had told him these things, that his heart died within him, and he became as a stone. And it came to pass about 10 days after," there's a number 10 appearing again, "that the Lord smote Nabal, and that he died. And when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, Blessed be the Lord, that has pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal, and has kept his servant from evil. For the Lord has returned the wickedness of Nabal upon his own head. And David sent and communed with Abigail to take her to him to wife." Now here it says in this passage that the Lord smote Nabal. It reminds me of the parable in Luke chapter 12, where it says, "But God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall those things be which you have provided?" Again, God calling that man in the parable in Luke 12 here a fool, just like Nabal's name means, foolish. Now, if we are honest with ourselves, none of us are sad that Nabal has died. I mean, the scripture itself and most of the people in the chapter witness to what type of man he was. Yet, I'm sure the question will arise, well, why was Nabal judged so quickly? I mean, was this the final straw that, this is what it took for him to finally be judged by God? Was he living a life of evil continually, and we're just kind of coming in at the last chapter of his life? I mean, King Saul, chased David for years. Saul did much evil. He gave David's wife to another man. On several occasions he tried to kill him personally, and then also with an army that he would gather together and chase David throughout Israel. Yet God allowed this continued harassment by Saul and evil toward David to continue. So again, we don't know the ways of God. We don't know why in one situation that God's hammer falls and his judgment falls, and then another he's very patient and merciful with someone else. That's why it's very dangerous to be judging anyone. Jesus said, "Judge not, lest ye be judged. Condemn not, and you shall not be condemned. For with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged yourself." So you have to be very careful about judging others and condemning others. But part of me thinks that David should not have had this type of attitude toward Nabal during his end. Again, from the book of Proverbs chapter 24, it says, "Rejoice not when thine enemy falls, and let not thine heart be glad when he stumbles, lest the Lord see it, and it displease him, and he turn away his wrath from him." Now, in this case, it was too late for Nabal because he was dead. But I think we need to remember, as I already quoted before from the Gospel of Luke chapter 6, that we need to love our enemies. Okay. Now let's get back to our chapter here, our text here, and verse 40. "And when the servants of David were come to Abigail to Carmel, they spake unto her, saying, David sent us unto thee to take thee to him to wife. And she rose and bowed herself on her face to the earth, and said, Behold, let thine handmaid be a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. And Abigail hasted and arose and rode upon an ass with 5 damsels of hers that went after her. And she went after the messengers of David and became his wife." By the way, the number 5 is the number of grace. So we see here God being gracious unto Abigail. Now, here we see the faith of Abigail. David is a fugitive. He's running for his life. He's not sure where his next meal is going to come from. And I'm sure Abigail was used to a certain type of lifestyle. If Nabal was living like a king, she certainly was living like a queen. She was going to be walking willingly into a very different environment with David and his men, with no real idea when David would finally be delivered from his enemies. Even David didn't know. He just had the promise that he would be king one day. She didn't know when Saul would stop chasing him. Neither did David. Yet she did have faith in God's word that David would one day be king. And when he was king, then she truly would be a queen. It also says here, back to our text, David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and they were also both of them his wives. So here we see that David is taking multiple wives. And what was his motivation? Well, in the next verse it says, "But Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Phalti, the son of Laish, which was of Gilim." So I'm wondering if David may have been kind of hedging his bets, so to speak. Maybe he was starting to develop a mistrust for women. Michal didn't seem to mind that she was given to another man, even though she was committing adultery. Saul forced her to commit adultery. We don't see Michal taking off and trying to find David in the wilderness. I guess I'm wondering if he was just wanted to have multiple wives just in case one wandered off like Michal did. It's just something to think about. Now, again, why did Saul do this? It's just part of the continued spiral downward of Saul. He's now added adultery to his list of sins, and it's probably just to try and cause David pain. He's already a mass murderer of his own people, so we can add adultery to mass murder on the list of Saul's sins.